In the late 1800s, Father Divine was born George Baker Jr. in a Black Maryland community named Monkey Run. His mother, Nancy Baker, was born enslaved to a Catholic family. When the Maryland State Assembly outlawed slavery in 1864, Nancy moved to Monkey Run and married George Baker Sr. The couple had George Baker Jr. a few years later. The residents of Monkey Run survived by working as domestic servants for the white families in nearby Rockville, Maryland. Due in part to stress and a substandard diet, Nancy Baker's weight increased rapidly. By the 1880s, she was so obese that she was unable to work. George Jr. was forced to quit school and find work to help support the family. George Jr. was influenced by many ideas circulating around him. Through his mother, who was exposed to Catholicism when she was enslaved, he gained an admiration of priests and nuns who took vows of chastity and chose to remain unmarried their entire lives. A prominent anti-alcohol movement in Maryland successfully lobbied the legislature to prohibit the sale of alcohol throughout the state in 1882. Black communities like Monkey Run, however, continued to consume and produce alcohol. George likely witnessed how alcohol brought enjoyment, income, but also addiction. He also had the opportunity to attend a freedmen's school. Freedmen's schools taught millions of Black Americans to read for the first time, but also promoted the philosophy of self-help. Students were taught that Black Americans bore the burden of improving their own situation. Through hard work, the students were taught, all Americans, including Blacks, could succeed. These teachings were also promoted in the writings and lectures of Booker T. Washington, a former slave who rose to prominence by arguing against civil rights protests in favor of Black self-improvement. In 1897, Nancy Baker passed away. The local paper reported that she was 5 feet tall and 480 pounds at the time of her death. Not soon after, George left Monkey Run. In 1899, George Baker arrived in Baltimore, Maryland. He found a city full of Black migrants in crowded conditions, searching for economic opportunities. He distanced himself from the conditions of Baltimore's Black working class when he secured a job as a gardener for an elderly white businessman named William Ortwine. At the time, the only Black people allowed to live in white Baltimore neighborhoods were Black servants who worked for white families. Once hired, George began living in the Ortwine family's servants' quarters. In addition to his work for the Ortwines, he advertised his services to Ortwine's neighbors to earn extra income. While in Baltimore, George entered the city's religious scene. Black middle-class people attended the more established mainstream churches of the Methodist, Episcopal, Presbyterian, and Baptist denominations. Working-class Blacks frequented storefront churches, which operated independently and taught heterodox religious doctrines. In 1902, George took his savings and headed south to begin preaching his own version of the gospel. Like his mother, George was short, standing at only 5 foot 2 inches. He also began balding at an early age. Despite his appearance, his message, which incorporated elements of Catholicism, storefront church traditions, and an ideology called New Thought, captivated listeners. The term New Thought describes a diverse set of views which emphasize the healing power of the mind. One of its earliest proponents was Phineas Quimby, who developed methods which he claimed Jesus Christ had used to cure disease. One of his patients was a woman named Mary Baker Eddy. Eddy struggled with sickness throughout her life and found initial relief through Quimby's techniques. From 1862 to 1865, Eddy visited Quimby several times to learn about his theories. In 1866, 1 month after Quimby died, Eddy slipped on an icy sidewalk and sustained injuries which left her bedridden. No longer able to turn to Phineas Quimby for help, Eddy turned to her faith. She claimed that while reading a story in the Bible about a healing, she was healed. Eddy began to study scriptures about divine, repeatable healing methods. There is some controversy about the extent to which Mary Eddy's work was influenced by Phineas Quimby. While both figures believed they had discovered the original healing techniques of Jesus Christ, Quimby embraced a more materialist perspective. Eddy, on the other hand, believed her discoveries were part of a forgotten form of Christianity. She believed that the material world was an illusion which resulted from mental states. She also taught that people could be harmed by the thoughts of others. In 1879, Mary Eddy founded the Church of Christ Scientist, whose goal was to restore so-called primitive Christianity and its lost element of healing. Mary Baker Eddy didn't explicitly prohibit members from seeking medical care, but over time, members placed increasingly more emphasis on spiritual healing as a sign of faith. It is widely believed that New Thought was a reaction to the rise of empiricism and the scientific method. Scientific breakthroughs in the 19th century provoked fears amongst some Christians that science would replace faith. During this period, reliable medical treatment was still in its infancy. People often suffered for years with unknown ailments. In some cases, the accepted medical treatment was worse than the disease. New Thought leaders attracted adherents by insisting that the first step to healing was an acceptance that disease was a product of the mind. Within New Thought, the term God was often replaced with terms like Father, Mother, Spirit, or Divine Mind. By 1907, George had returned from his mission trip back to Baltimore. He joined a Baptist storefront church where he became a popular speaker at prayer meetings and worship services. At one service, a man in the crowd requested an opportunity to address the congregation. The speech was going well until the man proclaimed, "I am the Father Eternal." The shocked congregants quickly threw the man out of the church. Born in Manor Township, Pennsylvania, Samuel Morris was a light-skinned middle-class husband and father of two. His work as a union steel worker, lay teacher, and deacon won him respect from his neighbors. Everything changed, however, when at 32, Samuel Morris suddenly left his family and renamed himself Father Jehovah. He claimed that his religious awakening occurred one night as he read the Bible and came across 1 Corinthians 3:16, which reads, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you?" Morris believed that the meaning of the verse was clear. Since he was a Christian, God dwelled within him. Since God dwelled within him, he was also God. As he preached to congregations throughout the Northeast United States, he kept his newfound identity to himself. It was only once he reached Baltimore that he revealed that he thought he was the Father Eternal. All the Baltimore congregations he had visited uniformly rejected Morris's message. George Baker was intrigued. He invited Morris to move into his home, which he shared with several other tenants. The men took on new names and titles. Samuel called himself Father Jehovah, God in the fathership degree, while George called himself the Messenger, God in the sonship degree. The pair held worship services from their home throughout the week. A man named Reverend Bishop St. John the Vine attended one such service. The Reverend was born John Hickerson in Alexandria, Virginia, and had worked as a cook, sailor, and lay minister. He came to Baltimore in 1905 and began spreading religious views influenced by Pentecostal and holiness churches. The Reverend accepted Father Jehovah's and the Messenger's divinity and also moved into their home. During home services, the Reverend showcased his Pentecostal background as he worshiped. He jumped, shouted, and mumbled in unintelligible languages. His displays of spirituality drew larger crowds to the meetings. Finally, Father Jehovah and the Messenger invited the Reverend to join their divine authority. He accepted their invitation and changed his title to Reverend Bishop St. John the Vine, God in the sonship degree. Through their informal church, the three men began to spread New Thought throughout the Black Baltimore community. But soon the partnership deteriorated. Father Jehovah and the Reverend had frequent fights about the exclusivity of the fathership degree. The Reverend argued that based on his understanding, God was equally present in all people and did not reside in various degrees of authority. In 1912, the Messenger concluded that both men were wrong. It was he, the Messenger, who was the only true human expression of God. The trio collapsed, and George Baker, the Messenger, set out on his own. Over the next 7 years, he traveled through the South preaching, building his following and developing his doctrine. As a symbol of his new movement, he took yet another new name, Reverend Major Jealous Divine. His followers called him simply Father Divine. Father Divine taught that he was a second physical manifestation of God. While God had chosen to appear in the flesh of a Jewish man in the 1st century, in the 19th century he had emerged in the body of a black man. He proclaimed 3 goals for his earthly ministry. His first goal was to prove to the world that the gospel could be preached without money and without price. He refused gifts, offerings, and tips of any kind, and criticized the practice of tithing. When he left Baltimore in 1912 to travel throughout the South, he accepted food and lodging in lieu of money. He helped the followers who traveled with him find jobs in the local areas where they stayed. These followers contributed their earnings to the total household expenses. He began hosting Holy Communion banquets, a symbolic representation of the Last Supper between Jesus Christ and his disciples. Attendees were asked to contribute 1 dish to the banquet, which often resulted in a lavish spread capable of feeding hundreds of people. As his followers sang hymns, Father Divine blessed each dish by inserting a serving spoon or fork into it before passing it around the table. Afterwards, Father Divine served the beverages. Later in the evening, he would give a sermon. Singing, praying, and celebrating often continued late into the night. Since many of his congregants struggled to meet their daily nutritional needs, these banquets served as a testimony to Father Divine's abundant blessings. Father Divine distrusted the banking system and instructed his followers to avoid life insurance, loans, and credit. He also strictly opposed welfare and government assistance programs. His second goal was to inform the world that Christ died that we might live, and not that we must die and go to the grave and then go to heaven. Drawing from New Thought philosophy, Father Divine taught that heaven and hell were conditions on earth which resulted from flawed thinking. He further claimed that the Spirit of God which dwelled in each person was enough to ensure eternal life on earth. He criticized the emphasis, particularly within Black churches, on liberation through death. In Father Divine's theology, happiness and success were available to those willing to transform their thinking. His third goal was to teach that out of one blood, God created all the nations to dwell upon the earth. Father Divine opposed all racial classifications and made racial integration mandatory within his movement. Members were purposely seated in an alternating manner so that Blacks were intermixed with whites. His movement opposed Jim Crow laws and protested against lynching. Gender roles were also rejected. Father Divine taught that though he had a male physical appearance, he was actually father, mother, sister, and brother simultaneously. Celibacy was enforced and marriage was discouraged because Father Divine taught that sexual activity drained the body of spiritual energy. He required men and women to stay in separate rooms, even if they were married. Many married women abandoned their families to join the movement. The enforcement of celibacy guaranteed that they could avoid the danger of childbirth, and the equal division of labor between men and women meant that they would no longer shoulder the full burden of domestic duties. Even a small number of men joined Father Divine's flock. Children were welcome as members believed that the movement's teachings would provide the proper stability and spirituality. As children got older, some chose to leave. Father Divine forbade their parents from going after them, explaining that membership in his movement was completely voluntary. He also insisted on specific language amongst his followers. Common racial terms of the day were replaced with phrases like people of light complexion or so-and-so people. Hello was replaced with peace when followers greeted each other so as to avoid the mention of hell. Maintaining a positive attitude was required, and followers often remarked, "It is wonderful," in response to good and bad circumstances. Father Divine's vision was an egalitarian heaven on earth. Accordingly, the residences where his followers lived were referred to as heavens. By 1914, less than 20 followers lived with Father Divine. World War I and the violent racial climate in the South encouraged millions of Black people to migrate to northern cities like New York. Black areas like Harlem, New York were similar to Baltimore, Maryland, overcrowded with substandard housing, addiction, and poverty. Dozens of new religious groups and preachers dominated the streets by day, and a bustling nightlife with dance halls and casinos ran the city by night. Father Divine moved his flock to Brooklyn to keep his group isolated from what he viewed as the corrupting culture of Harlem. During the day, his followers worked various jobs which allowed them to pool their resources for maintenance of the apartment. Each evening, they hosted a Holy Communion banquet. Father Divine forbade his followers from smoking, profanity, drugs, and alcohol. However, unlike other religious groups, he didn't restrict his followers from consuming Black Southern cuisine or soul food. In fact, he weighed his followers several times a week and chastised members who had lost weight. Food was evidence of Father Divine's ability to meet his followers' physical needs. At some point during this period, Father Divine met a lighter-skinned, heavy-set woman named Panania, whose background has never been firmly established. Panania traveled with Father Divine as a follower until they eventually married. They told people their marriage date was June 6, 1882, but it's possible they were referring to the date when Panania first believed in God. Irregardless, Father Divine insisted that his marriage was completely spiritual and would never be physically consummated. The marriage, he said, represented God's love and intimacy with mankind. Panania was called Mother Divine. Father Divine viewed the Harlem Renaissance, Black society, and other religions as sinful and wayward. He limited his interactions with these cultures to those necessary to attract new followers to his movement. In 1919, he decided to move his movement once again. A small town called Sayville in Long Island was just a short distance from New York City. White, affluent New Yorkers spent their summers in Sayville, while a smaller number of permanent residents enjoyed the quiet atmosphere all year long. During World War I, a resident of Sayville named Edward Felgenhauer changed his name to Edward Fellows in response to anti-German sentiment. In response, another German-born Sayville resident called Edward a coward. The two began having arguments which continued even after the end of the war. In the fall of 1919, Fellows was fed up. He put his house up for sale and sought revenge against his rival by advertising his desire for a colored buyer. At the time, white homeowners were led to believe that having Black neighbors would drive down their property values. Father Divine saw Fellows' advertisement and quickly bought the house. On October 27, 1919, Father and Mother Divine became Sayville's first Black homeowners. Father Divine established a rapport with the wealthy residents in Sayville by establishing Busy Bee Employment Agency, through which he hired out his followers as domestic workers. The residents of Sayville jumped at the chance to hire workers who lived locally, since doing so was cheaper than depending on unreliable workers to come in from the city or hiring live-in help. He also started a project called the Refuge Home for the Poor Only, which opened the doors of his large home to the homeless so long as they agreed to abide by his rules. While many stayed only until they got on their feet, others joined Father Divine's group permanently. Father Divine's movement began surging at least 2 years before the economic crash of 1929. The supposed prosperity of the 20s did not reach the Black community, and Father Divine's emphasis on providing food, clothing, and shelter attracted many to his group. Some white people also joined the movement. Many of them heard about Father Divine from Black domestic workers and became members after attending a Holy Communion banquet. The Great Depression grew his following further and helped him establish one of the few interracial organizations in existence at the time. But just when the movement began growing, the residents of Sayville became resentful of its presence. Sayville residents claimed that the Holy Communion banquets, which now attracted larger numbers of people, were too noisy and went too late into the night. They traded rumors about alleged sexual activities going on in Father Divine's house. Many of them became uncomfortable with the interracial living arrangements mandated by Father Divine. Sayville residents also found it rude and tacky that Father Divine flaunted his wealth by adding extra rooms to his home and purchasing a fleet of automobiles for his followers to use. Determined to find some way to rid themselves of the preacher, the community asked the district attorney to investigate. The district attorney hired a young Black woman named Susan Hadley to infiltrate the group. Hadley arrived at a worship service one night claiming to be unemployed and homeless. Father Divine was hesitant, but told Hadley that if she was willing to leave her family and former life behind, she could stay. Hadley found that Divine's followers lived strict lives. Most residents had a job outside the home, while a few spent their days within the home cleaning, cooking, and doing other chores. At night, Holy Communion banquets were held. Religious leaders would come to the banquets from out of town to discuss theology with Father Divine. Hadley tried to ask other followers about their past, but all of them refused to provide any information. They all had chosen new names like Queen Esther or Prophet Cicero. They told Hadley that once she understood that Father Divine was God, she too would forget her past self. The followers insisted that genuine belief in Father Divine's divinity would grant Hadley immortality. They claimed that all desires could be filled and all sicknesses healed by channeling his power in her mind. After some time, Susan Hadley left and reported that she had found no moral or legal violations within the movement, and she didn't observe any donations or collections being taken. She assumed that Father Divine was living off of an inheritance. The local newspapers reported on the investigation, which sparked more curiosity about Father Divine's wealth, philosophies, and lifestyle. The investigation, which Sayville residents had hoped would smear Father Divine, had actually led to more publicity for his movement. During Susan Hadley's stay, about 30 residents were living in the Sayville residence, and a few more followers lived outside the home. About 60 people attended banquets on the weekends. After publication of news about the undercover investigation, the number of weekend banquet attendees rose to over 100. On May 9, 1931, the deputy sheriff arrived and placed Father Divine under arrest for maintaining a public nuisance. Father Divine pleaded not guilty, and the judge set his bail at $1,000. Onlookers were shocked when Mother Divine pulled $1,000 in cash from her pocket and quickly paid. To the irritation of Sayville residents, the trial was delayed until the fall of that year. The residents of Sayville were happy to accept cheap, reliable domestic labor. However, over Father Divine's 10 years in town, more Black people had relocated to the area. Many of them were not seeking domestic work and were sharing private residences with wealthy white followers. This arrangement upset the accepted racial order. The publicity about the upcoming trial brought even more followers to Father Divine's movement. Attendance at his banquets rose to over 500 people. To accommodate all the attendees, continuous sittings of the Holy Communion banquets were held all day on the weekends. Traffic jams occurred as hopefuls attempted to make their way from the mainland to the small town. At any given moment, several buses and hundreds of cars could be seen parked outside Father Divine's home. Residents were furious but had few options until the trial occurred. Father Divine seemed unfazed by the possibility of a conviction. The growth of his movement required new meeting spaces. His followers rented churches and other venues in New York City, sometimes scheduling multiple services at different locations on the same night. When those rented spaces grew too small, they rented out Rockland Palace in Harlem, which boasted a 5,000-person seating capacity. Soon, Father Divine was traveling to evening meetings in New Jersey and other surrounding states so frequently that he suspended services in Sayville. New members began to hold banquets in their own homes and always reserved 2 empty seats for Father and Mother Divine. Father Divine's trial date arrived in May of 1932. Testimony was heard in Nassau County Supreme Court with Justice Lewis J. Smith presiding. As homeowners testified against Father Divine, Justice Smith was clearly disturbed. He interrupted witnesses multiple times by asking questions from the bench or answering questions on witnesses' behalf. Father Divine's witnesses testified to the orderliness of the meetings and denied he had ever claimed to heal diseases. They emphasized that he encouraged people to heal themselves. After closing arguments, the judge abruptly ordered that the jury ignore all testimony from witnesses not present on the night of Father Divine's arrest. This meant that nearly all testimony from Father Divine's defense witnesses could not be considered during deliberations. After only 15 minutes, the jury returned a verdict of guilty against Father Divine. On June 5th, he returned to court for sentencing. Justice Smith announced his own research had revealed that the defendant's real name was George Baker and that he was not an ordained minister. He claimed to have discovered that Father Divine was born in the South and was not legally married to Mother Divine. He also accused Father Divine of breaking up families, swindling people out of money, and mentally abusing his followers. At the conclusion of his speech, he sentenced Father Divine to the maximum sentence of 1 year in jail and a fine of $500. Father Divine's supporters and attorney were shocked, but vowed to file an appeal. Days later, on June 9th, Justice Smith awoke in the middle of the night and complained to his wife about chest pains. By the time the family doctor arrived, Justice Smith was dead from a heart attack. When asked later about the mysterious death of the judge after his sentencing, Father Divine remarked, "I hated to do it." On June 25, 1932, Father Divine's appeal was granted and he was released on $5,000 bail. Before his imprisonment, he avoided political topics and resisted using his movement to influence elections. After his release, his speeches began to draw a direct connection between his spiritual teachings and political realities. One possible reason for this shift was that his membership was growing and changing once again. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican immigrant who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. The UNIA grew to be one of the most popular Black organizations in the 1920s and had hundreds of chapters nationwide. In 1927, however, Garvey was convicted of mail fraud and deported, leaving a power vacuum in industrial cities like New York, where the UNIA was very popular. Former UNIA members found new religious groups like Father Divine's through which they could continue to express their racial, economic, and political views. One of the UNIA's former officers, Mamie Leon Turpot de Mena, had been editor of the UNIA publication Negro World. When she joined the Peace Mission movement, she used the former Negro World presses to print a new publication called World Echo, aimed at spreading Father Divine's message. The teachings of Garvey and Divine were similar in many ways. Both supported capitalism and self-reliance. However, the two were at odds on the topic of race and religion. Marcus Garvey wanted Black people to define and maintain a separate ethnic identity. Father Divine refused to recognize race as a reality at all. Father Divine taught a heterodox form of Christianity and claimed to be a physical manifestation of God. Marcus Garvey adhered to more orthodox Catholic views.
There is no God but one almighty being of heaven, wherever heaven is. He is the creator of the universe. Man is but a small part of his creation, and Father Divine is but man. He is physical flesh and blood, and of spirit, just like another human being. And if it is true that he assumes the role of God, then he must be mad or a wicked contriver of deception.
Garvey accused Father Divine of running a colossal racket. He also spread allegations that Father Divine was accepting donations from the Ku Klux Klan. Interestingly, Garvey had previously praised white supremacist groups in the 1920s because he agreed with their racial separatist views. Lastly, Garvey attacked Father Divine's teachings about celibacy, labeling it race suicide. Despite these criticisms, Father Divine's physical presence in the United States lured UNIA members to his movement. In 1933, Father Divine claimed that he had over 10 million disciples. The true number of followers is not known because no membership records were kept. The first Peace Mission restaurants opened in New York City, New York, and Newark, New Jersey in 1932. Soon, Peace Mission hotels, clothing stores, markets, and other businesses were launched. In each case, followers consulted Father Divine and followed his financial teachings. In addition to rejecting debt, credit, tips, and insurance policies, Father Divine also demanded that prices remain low. Peace Mission restaurants were able to charge only 5 or 10 cents per meal by purchasing day-old breads, overripe produce, and other edible food from businesses at lower prices. In the midst of the Great Depression, the success of Peace Mission businesses seemed to reflect the truth of Father Divine's teachings. But once again, with success came attacks and criticism. The Ku Klux Klan burned a cross inscribed with the words Father Divine at one of the New Jersey Peace Mission worship locations. Many African American newspapers labeled Father Divine a fraud. Reverend Bishop St. John the Vine reemerged and gave an interview to the New York Amsterdam News. He claimed that Father Divine perverted his teachings, broke up families, and undermined the Black community.
It ain't as if I was trying to knock Father Divine. I merely want to see that my people are not led astray.
But none of these attacks stopped the growth of Father Divine's movement. Finally, on January 9, 1933, a higher court overturned Father Divine's conviction based on Justice Smith's bias. Free from the prospect of any more jail time, Father Divine continued publicizing his movement by partnering with newspapers and gaining followers with powerful connections. This widespread dissemination of his ideas led to the formation of more peace mission communities in places like Washington State and California. In 1934, the Peace Mission had 72 extensions. By 1935, the number of extensions had grown to 134. Father Divine had been an outspoken critic of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Firstly, he opposed the New Deal programs because he believed they encouraged lifelong government dependency. Secondly, he noticed that the New Deal was not offered equally to Black and white citizens. Domestic and agricultural workers, which were jobs overwhelmingly held by Black people, were excluded from many of the programs. Thirdly, Father Divine opposed Roosevelt's ending of prohibition. Father Divine's followers decided to create a political platform which reflected their values. Those in Los Angeles organized the 1936 International Divine Righteous Government Convention, which hosted 5,000 delegates from peace missions around the world. State representatives, candidates, and community leaders also attended. Although Father Divine advised his followers in their efforts, the followers wrote most of the political platform. Using quotes from Father Divine in the document, they advocated for strict unionization guidelines, an end to capital punishment, the repeal of laws requiring insurance, and the eradication of racism, including the elimination of racial terms. They denounced President Roosevelt's crop destruction policy and public assistance programs. The rollout of the platform was timed to occur at the beginning of the presidential election year. Father Divine's followers maintained that they were not intending to start a third-party movement, but promised that Father Divine would endorse any candidate who endorsed the entire platform. They established a righteous government department within the Peace Mission movement and recommended that extensions establish one as well. Father Divine spoke at the convention and assured his followers that the platform would be accepted. However, as the election approached, national politicians refused to endorse the platform. Father Divine and his supporters attempted to exert pressure by warning that the Peace Mission controlled a large number of votes around the country. This warning was ignored, and Father Divine ordered his followers nationwide to stay home and not vote on Election Day. When the results were announced, President Roosevelt won election again, and there was no evidence of a sharp decrease in Black turnout in comparison to past elections. Father Divine might have had a large influence over people, but this influence did not translate into political power. Some noted that many of his followers were immigrants who could not vote, or uneducated people who could not overcome various literacy tests around the country. Black followers, who made up a large part of the movement, faced numerous forms of racial discrimination when trying to vote. Others surmised that Father Divine's following was too spread out to exercise power in any single locality. For the 1940 election, Father Divine would try again to shift the political landscape. The focus for that year's International Righteous Government Convention was opposition to lynching. The organization launched a letter-writing campaign to urge passage of an anti-lynching bill. They successfully gathered 250,000 signatures, but the movement's anti-lynching petition received no interest from Congress. A foreign policy proposal was included in the anti-lynching bill, which sought to bring North, South, and Central America under the control of the United States. This likely deterred people and politicians who would have otherwise supported an anti-lynching bill. After the results of the 1936 and 1940 election cycles, Father Divine seemed eager to distract his followers from the failure of their political activities. He turned his teachings back to the mental causes of Earth's problems. For the first time since his movement began, his followers had witnessed the limits of Father Divine's power.
The reality of perfection of all things with which we come in contact. Develop perfection and bring these qualities to fruition and establish them among this people. Religiously, yes, of course. One of the great morals and the foundation thereof, which I am bringing to the surface again, where men had buried in sin, in graft and greed and in selfishness. I am bringing this principle back to the surface, that mankind might become to be exemplifiers of righteousness, truth, and justice, that these qualities might be established universally.
Before joining the Peace Mission, John the Revelator was a millionaire named John West Hunt. He spent most of his time getting drunk and having casual sex, which ruined 3 marriages. After a near-death experience, he came across Father Divine's teachings, and John, his brother, and his mother joined the Peace Mission movement. He wrote a full confession of his past sins and mailed hundreds of copies to friends, family, and public officials. He returned to old girlfriends and associates, attempting to convert them. He also began financing Peace Mission activities and opened up his Beverly Hills home for Holy Communion banquets. It wasn't long before his financial generosity and his amazing personal testimony made him a well-known figure throughout the California movement. John began a Peace Mission tour in 1936 to spread his conversion story. At a Peace Mission in Denver, Colorado, the Jewett family was transfixed as they sat in the audience and listened to John's sermon. Afterwards, John invited 17-year-old Delight Jewett to ride in his brand new Packard automobile with him and his staff. Delight and her parents eagerly accepted. The car ride turned into a worship session, complete with singing and speaking in tongues. John gave Delight a new name, Mary Dove, and took her on an $800 shopping spree. When everyone returned, John remarked that Delight would make a perfect addition to his staff. It's not clear whether or not the Jewett parents agreed to this arrangement, but that night she, John the Revelator, and his staff left Denver. When John arrived back in Beverly Hills with Delight, he gave her yet another name, Virgin Mary. Suddenly, John began claiming that he was divine. He also claimed that Delight had spiritual powers and prophesied that she would give birth to a new Redeemer by immaculate conception. At some point, he initiated intimate contact with the 17-year-old. When John informed Father Divine by telegram about his actions, Father Divine swiftly condemned John for violating his commitment to celibacy and for claiming he was Jesus. Meanwhile, the Jewetts pleaded for John to bring their daughter back to Denver. Instead, John took Delight to Father Divine's home in Harlem. Father Divine separated the pair and sent Delight to a Peace Mission farm in Kingston, New York. The Jewetts traveled to New York to find their daughter. Once at the Kingston farm, the followers agreed to take Delight's mother, Elizabeth Jewett, to Delight's dormitory. When Miss Jewett attempted to hug her daughter, Delight rejected her. Delight claimed that she couldn't be touched since she was in immortality, and that her mother shouldn't worry because she was going to have a child by Jesus, who would be the Redeemer of the world. When Elizabeth Jewett was reunited with her husband Lee Jewett at the evening's Holy Communion banquet, she told him what had happened. She was shocked to find him calm and unconcerned. Father Divine had spoken to Lee and offered him a managerial position over several Peace Mission farms. John the Revelator had also met with Lee and apologized. Lee forgave John and was considering joining the movement. It was only when Lee's request for financial restitution was refused that he allegedly listened to his wife's pleas to leave the Kingston farm. Father Divine's attorney had advised Father Divine not to pay any restitution and told the Jewett family to return to Denver and keep what had happened to themselves. Instead, the Jewett family took delight to New York City, where they sold their story to the New York Evening Journal. The paper was owned by the infamous William Randolph Hearst, who popularized yellow journalism, a sensationalized style of journalism that was more focused on selling papers than reporting accurate facts. The New York Evening Journal referred the family to an attorney and committed to pay Lee Jewett $100 a week until the case was resolved. The journalists working on the story at the New York Evening Journal reported the Jewett's allegations to the FBI before releasing the story. The FBI investigation resulted in an arrest warrant for John the Revelator and his staff members for violating the Mann Act, which prohibited transportation of minors across state lines for immoral purposes. After a nationwide manhunt, John the Revelator surrendered and was put on trial. On the stand, John explained that Father Divine had taught him to be truthful and had asked him to confess to what he had done. John admitted to most of the allegations. The jury found John guilty and his co-defendants were found not guilty. The judge sentenced John to 3 years in prison. While incarcerated, he changed his name to the Prodigal Son and continued to follow Father Divine. On April 20th, 1937, a fight broke out when 2 process servers attempted to give Father Divine a summons at an evening service, and one server was stabbed. Father Divine fled the scene. In the wake of Father Divine's disappearance, a high-profile member announced that she was starting her own movement. Faithful Mary joined the movement as Viola Wilson. After working as a domestic in Georgia, she decided to move to Newark, New Jersey, where she opened a small business. Her business failed. She became homeless and was forced to scavenge for food in trash cans. Soon she developed alcohol addiction and contracted tuberculosis. After a blackout, one of her friends dropped her off at a peace mission. The kindness, shelter, food, and clothes she received, as well as a sermon she heard from Father Divine, convinced her to confess her sins and join his movement. After assuming the name Faithful Mary and regaining her health, she became an example of Father Divine's transformative power. She opened her own mission in Newark, New Jersey to help others like herself. Faithful Mary's disagreements with her leader started with a $10,000 donation from a new member. The member offered the donation to Father Divine first, but he refused to accept it. This member later offered it to Faithful Mary, who invested half of it in her peace mission businesses and deposited the rest of it in her personal bank account. Father Divine found out and ordered Mary to return the money. When she refused, he punished her by forcing her to give control of her peace mission properties to other followers and assigning her to kitchen duty. Years after the dispute, with Father Divine on the run, Faithful Mary announced that Father Divine was just a damn man, and she started the Universal Light Movement. Authorities found Father Divine hiding in a Connecticut extension and returned him to New York. When he was released from jail, he told Faithful Mary to turn over her Newark peace mission. However, though several members had contributed money to buy this property, only Faithful Mary's name was on the deed. She refused to leave, and physical fights occurred between her supporters and members of the peace mission. Faithful Mary published an expose entitled, "God, He's Just a Natural Man," in which she described an environment of financial and sexual exploitation. Mary alleged that there was a holy treasury where payments from all extensions and businesses were deposited weekly. This money in turn was used to finance Father Divine's lavish lifestyle. She also claimed that in contrast to his teachings about celibacy, the sex-segregated sleeping quarters were hotbeds of same-sex intimate activity. She further claimed that Father Divine wasn't celibate either, and had initiated intimate interactions with many women in the movement, including her. He rationalized these interactions by telling women that intimacy with him was a blessing from God. William Hearst and his legal team supported Mary in publicizing her accusations. Hearst's lawyer, William Lesselbaum, also offered his legal services to other disgruntled members like Verinda and Thomas Brown. The Browns filed a lawsuit demanding the return of $4,476 from Father Divine. In their lawsuit, Verinda and her husband Thomas explained that they were longtime followers. Thomas Brown had been arrested with Father Divine in Sayville in 1931, and throughout their time in the movement, they had provided linens, furniture, and expensive suits. They had also entrusted their life savings to the movement in fear of the tumultuous financial landscape of the Great Depression. However, when they left the movement in 1935 and asked for their funds to be returned, Father Divine refused. Faithful Mary testified on the Browns' behalf by repeating the allegations she had made in her exposé. She claimed in court that Father Divine pooled his followers' money and then dictated how the funds would be distributed for various projects. The court ruled in favor of the Browns and ordered the Peace Mission movement to return their money. Father Divine and his attorneys feared that following the court's orders would make them vulnerable to more lawsuits from former members. They engaged in several legal maneuvers to avoid paying the Browns. These maneuvers failed, and the courts affirmed the order to return the Browns' money. In response, Father Divine moved his movement to Philadelphia. His legal team informed him that New York state law prohibited summons from being served on Sunday. Over the next several years, Father Divine would make visits to New York only on Sundays and remain in Philadelphia for the rest of the week. Faithful Mary would also return, begging for forgiveness. The number of followers in her Universal Light movement had declined. Her various business ventures she had started with money from her exposé had failed. She had tried to make a career in Hollywood, but that also fizzled out. She claimed that William Hearst Associates had supported her defection and encouraged her to start drinking again and using drugs. A near-fatal automobile accident convinced her that she was being punished for her attacks against Father Divine. Father Divine graciously forgave Faithful Mary, but she was never given power, position, or property in the movement again. Through these scandals, Father Divine realized that his spirit was not enough to keep control of the movement. From 1937 to 1942, he methodically began forming a legally recognized church. He established one official newspaper called New Day, and other papers were disbanded. 3 churches incorporated with the same constitutions and bylaws while remaining financially independent: Palace Mission Church, Circle Mission Church, and Unity Mission Church. All Peace Mission property and businesses were transferred to one of these 3 entities. Followers would no longer be able to establish Peace Missions spontaneously without approval. Father Divine also created 2 new orders with separate creeds and uniforms. The first was the Rosebuds, the official female-only choir of the movement. Rosebuds took a vow to remain virgins and be submissive, meek, and sweet. The second order was a male-only group called the Crusaders. Crusaders pledged to remain celibate and acted as waiters at Peace Mission banquets. The 2 orders sought to counteract the allegations about the movement and present a clean, wholesome image. As the United States entered World War II, the Depression was ending and a time of unabashed patriotism was beginning. Relief programs and assistance within the movement declined, and less emphasis was placed on providing for people's basic needs. While Father Divine had previously opposed involvement in war, he eventually loosened his pacifist stance and members were allowed to follow their consciences. Some registered as conscientious objectors, while others enlisted to fight. Father Divine encouraged his followers to buy war bonds and criticized Hitler. The FBI infiltrated the organization based on rumors that Father Divine was supporting the Empire of Japan, communism, or collaborating with other Axis powers, but found no evidence of such claims. These moves to prevent the destruction of his movement from internal and external forces stunted its growth. The allegations of corruption and a more rigid organizational structure made Father Divine seem like a more typical religious and earthly presence. In 1943, Mother Divine suddenly died. At first, Father Divine did not comment on her passing. One of his newer converts was a white Canadian high schooler named Edna Rose Richens. Richens was a member of the exclusive Rosebuds order and was given the name Sweet Angel when she joined the movement. She worked her way up to the position of personal secretary to Father Divine. One day, Sweet Angel allegedly told Father Divine that she wanted to marry him because she knew he was God. To her surprise, Father Divine agreed. On April 29, 1946, Father Divine and Sweet Angel got married in Washington, D.C., but withheld the information from the public. At the time, interracial marriage was illegal in many states. Father Divine also worried that the marriage would cause his followers to doubt his teachings about celibacy. However, when Sweet Angel's visa expired and she was faced with potential deportation, Father Divine announced the marriage. He explained to his followers that Peninia had left her old body and had been reborn in a more youthful body. Sweet Angel had been selected as a vessel, he claimed, because of her virginity and spiritual devotion. Members calmly accepted Father Divine's explanation and celebrated the marriage as a sign of victory over racial classifications. The wedding date of Father Divine and Sweet Angel became a movement holiday. To dispel any rumors of sexual contact, Father Divine assigned a Black disciple as a constant companion to Sweet Angel. For a few members, Father Divine's marriage was a wake-up call. The prodigal son, John Hunt, who had remained committed to the movement even during his imprisonment, began a relationship with one of the Rosebuds named Carol Sweet. In 1948, the prodigal son and Carol Sweet left the movement and got married. In a long letter to the FBI, John Hunt claims that his conviction under the Mann Act for the incident with Delight Jewett was caused in part by mental manipulation by Father Divine. He explained a culture of fear where followers believed that if they disobeyed Father Divine, they would die. The death of Judge Smith in the Sayville case and even seemingly unrelated tragedies around the world were attributed to the power of Father Divine against those that disobeyed him. John Hunt and Carol Sweet began a campaign against Father Divine, claiming that the movement was a hoax. Carol Sweet alleged that Father Divine had intimately assaulted her. The couple found others who alleged that Father Divine had coerced them into intimacy, sometimes when they were minors. They tried to get Father Divine charged under the Mann Act, but the FBI could not uncover enough evidence to support criminal charges. Defenders of Father Divine responded that Carol Sweet was simply jealous. She had expected to be chosen as Father Divine's new wife and was angry that Sweet Angel was chosen instead. In a May 1965 issue of Ebony magazine, Ruth Boaz published a story entitled My 30 Years with Father Divine. Boaz tells the story of how she joined Father Divine's movement in 1932 after having only received an 8th grade education, getting married at 15, and having a child at 16. She attended a Holy Communion banquet in the Harlem residence of a follower, which was presided over by Father Divine. Immediately, she was invited to take the seat of honor, which had normally been reserved for one of Father Divine's favorite secretaries. Father Divine gave her a new name, Ruth Boaz. During the next several days, she confessed all of her sins and said that she quickly fell in love with him. The relationship quickly became physical. Boaz was confused about whether this violated the movement's teachings about celibacy. Father Divine assured her that Mary was no virgin and that Jesus had been conceived through a physical union between Mary and Joseph. These teachings confused her since she had always believed in the virginity of Mary and in the Immaculate Conception of Jesus. When questioned further about why he was allowed to have intimate relations and his followers were not, Father Divine told Ruth, "When I have intimate relations with you, I am bringing your desire to the surface so that I can eliminate it." For the next 2 years, Ruth Boaz served as Father Divine's secretary and intimate partner until one day a new, younger secretary took her place. Suddenly, Father Divine fired her and told her to find a domestic job. Ruth complied and found a job through the movement's employment agency. For 9 years, she stayed in the movement while working as a housekeeper. On her days off, she came to headquarters to meet with Father Divine and give him all but a few dollars of her earnings to him in an envelope. Ruth wrote that there was a category of followers called wholeheartedly consecrated members, which was the highest level of movement recognition. These members were distinguished for their complete submission to Father Divine. They were expected to convert all of their assets to cash so that the money could be donated to the movement, and were told not to discuss these donations with anyone. They were warned that the punishment for doing so would be death. Followers who worked non-organization jobs were most likely to become so-called consecrated members. They would schedule an interview with Father Divine on payday or their days off to give him their earnings minus anything they kept for their own needs. These so-called interviews, during which money was exchanged, were not allowed to last more than 5 seconds. Citing his opposition to Social Security, Father Divine ensured that all followers who worked within the movement were exempt. These followers also signed contracts stating that their work was voluntary and that they did not expect compensation. While it was true that there were no properties in Father Divine's name and that he reported no income to the authorities, Father Divine was actually in control of millions of dollars. He dramatically and publicly refused donations from outsiders to maintain the impression that he wasn't directly profiting from his following. Ruth believed that the second Mother Divine, Edna Richens, was in fact a virgin. She believed that Father Divine did not attempt any intimate contact with her in order to maintain her belief in him as God and assure that she would run the movement as he aged. Ruth finally left the movement after suffering a heart attack. She attempted to stay in one of the Peace Mission hotels to recuperate, but was kicked out due to an argument. When she told Father Divine about the incident, he responded glibly, "If you're in need, go to the Salvation Army." In the 1950s, a wealthy follower purchased Woodmont, a 72-acre estate in a wealthy white area of Philadelphia. The mansion included tennis courts, a swimming pool, horse stables, walking paths, and many other amenities. After some renovations, Father Divine moved into the property in 1953. As Father Divine aged, he was seen less frequently by anyone except a few high-ranking followers. Ruth noted in her Ebony article that Father Divine's decline began when he developed diabetes, became dependent on insulin, and could no longer consume the same food as everyone else at Holy Communion banquets. After that, it became difficult for him to walk, and he had to be carried into the dining room and placed in his chair before the banquet was open to attendees. Finally, he stopped all public appearances in 1963. On September 10, 1965, Father Divine, the man who claimed to be God, died. Followers gave various explanations for their leader's death. Some said he chose to lay his body down. Others said his departure was punishment against mankind for their sins. Mother Divine settled the debate by teaching that Father Divine's spirit remained with his followers and that his death was a supreme sacrifice made for the salvation of humanity. She prophesied that Father Divine would rise from the dead, but that followers should continue to act as if he were present in the meantime. Mother Divine subsequently took control of what remained of the movement. The last Peace Mission Promised Land colony in Ulster County, New York was sold in 1985. By 1986, the Peace Mission's New Day publication had only 800 subscribers. The last two Philadelphia hotels, the Divine Lorraine and the Divine Tracy, were closed in 1999 and 2006. A handful of older followers supported the maintenance of the Woodmont estate. They continued to hold Holy Communion banquets, during which a seat was always reserved for Father Divine. In March of 2017, Mother Divine died at the age of 92. In recent years, many researchers have attempted to cast Father Divine in a progressive light. They question why he hasn't been given credit as a forerunner of the civil rights movement. The reason the Peace Mission is controversial is because its emphasis on racial integration, non-traditional gender roles, and communal living were not meant for societal change, but for social control. In an era when most Black religious sects were teaching racial separatism, the Peace Mission's rejection of racial identity was unique. However, to the Peace Mission, racial integration was sadly just an alternative lifestyle relative to the norms of the time. True integration would have allowed the potential for interracial romantic love, which in turn would have led to even more violent attacks and a much swifter end to the movement. Celibacy was a necessary component for Father Divine to expand his pool of potential followers to include whites. Father Divine transcended racial barriers not through the power of his spirit, but through the funding and adoration from wealthy white members. His Black membership, meanwhile, made up the bulk of his business empire's workforce. Ex-members like Ruth Boaz noted that the majority of leadership of the peace mission was white, and the majority of the laity was Black. Apparently, conditions in the peace mission were eerily similar to those in the greater society. Father Divine's interpretations of New Thought were partially correct. Control of the mind was necessary to change his material conditions. Once he had psychological control of his followers, once they believed he was God, they were unable to challenge the contradictions between his teachings and his behavior. Far from trying to end the injustices in society, Father Divine used them to create his own heaven on earth.